In 1908, three brothers digging in a limestone cave near La Chapelle-aux-Saints in southern France uncovered a skeleton curled on its side in a shallow pit. The skull was heavy-browed, the jaw thick, the bones unmistakably Neanderthal. But it was the condition of those bones that stopped researchers cold. The spine was twisted with arthritis. Nearly every tooth in the lower jaw had fallen out years before death, the sockets fully healed over. The hip joints showed degeneration so severe that walking must have been agony. This was not a man in his 20s. Paleopathologists, who later re-examined the remains, estimated he was somewhere between 35 and 45 years old when he died, ancient by Neanderthal standards, and he had been living with crippling disability for years before the end. Somebody had been feeding him. Soft food, easy to chew with no teeth left. Somebody had been keeping him near the fire. The question this skeleton raises is bigger than one broken old man in one French cave. How long could a Neanderthal actually expect to live? Was 35 the ceiling or the exception? And if disease, injury, and violence killed most of them young, how did a species survive for over 300,000 years on a foundation of dead adolescents, broken bodies, and a fossil record that keeps producing the same unsettling pattern no matter which cave archaeologists dig into next? The easy assumption is that Neanderthals died young, because everyone in the deep past died young. Life was brutal, medicine did not exist, and by 30 you were finished. There is a kernel of truth buried in that assumption. Neanderthal skeletal populations really do skew young. But the reason is not simply that nobody made it past 30. It is that the demographic math of small hunting bands, chronic injury, and a complete absence of modern medicine produced a survival curve unlike anything a person living today has ever experienced. One where infancy was the deadliest stretch of the whole lifespan, where a broken leg could be a death sentence, and where reaching 40 made you something close to a living archive. To understand what a Neanderthal life actually looked like from birth to death, you have to walk through it stage by stage, the way the evidence from their bones forces you to. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The single most dangerous period of a Neanderthal life was also the shortest: infancy. Paleodemographers reconstructing age-at-death profiles from Neanderthal cemetery sites, including the cluster of burials at Krapina in Croatia and the remains recovered from Shanidar cave in Iraq, consistently find that a large share of individuals died before the age of 2. Anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who spent decades building mortality profiles from fragmentary Neanderthal remains, estimated that somewhere between a quarter and a third of Neanderthal infants did not survive their first year. The causes were not exotic. Cold stress, since Neanderthal infants, like all human infants, lost heat rapidly and could not regulate their own body temperature. Gastrointestinal infection from contaminated water or spoiled meat, since there was no way to know a food source had turned dangerous until someone got sick from it. Birth complications themselves, since a difficult delivery in a cave with no surgical intervention available could kill mother, infant, or both. A Neanderthal band that successfully raised 5 children to walking age had probably watched at least 1 or 2 die in their first months. This was not a tragedy that happened to unlucky families. It was the baseline condition of Neanderthal reproduction, and every surviving toddler represented a small demographic victory against very steep odds. To put that infant mortality figure in perspective, modern hunter-gatherer populations studied by anthropologists in the 20th century, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania or the Ache of Paraguay, living without hospitals or vaccines, but with access to generations of accumulated medical knowledge about herbs, wound care, and food safety, typically lose somewhere between 15 and 20% of infants in the first year. Neanderthals, operating with far less of that kind of accumulated pharmacological knowledge and facing colder, harsher environments than either of those groups, appear to have lost even more. Every Neanderthal woman who raised a child to adolescence had, statistically, already buried at least one infant along the way. This was not an occasional family tragedy. It was the arithmetic that every Neanderthal band lived inside for the entire existence of the species. Childhood past infancy was somewhat safer, but not by much. Once a Neanderthal child reached 3 or 4, the dangers shifted from disease and cold towards something closer to what killed the adults: physical trauma. Neanderthal children's skeletons recovered from sites across Europe show healed fractures at rates well above what you would expect in a modern population, and the locations of those fractures, arms, skulls, ribs, match the kind of injuries you would get from falls in rocky terrain rather than from violence. This makes sense given the landscape Neanderthals occupied. Ice Age Europe was not gentle ground. Steep limestone gorges, loose scree slopes, riverbanks slick with ice for half the year. A child learning to move through that world, following adults on foraging trips or scrambling near cave entrances, was constantly exposed to the kind of fall that a modern child would walk away from with a bruise, but that in a world without antibiotics or set bones, could turn a simple fracture into a fatal infection. Children who survived to adolescence had, in effect, already passed through the 2 deadliest filters of the entire Neanderthal life course. What came next was arguably even harder. There is an important statistical distinction hiding underneath all of this, and it changes how you should read every age figure in this story. Life expectancy at birth, the number most often quoted for prehistoric populations, is an average pulled down heavily by the sheer number of infants and small children who died before the age of 5. A Neanderthal population, with life expectancy at birth somewhere in the low 20s, a figure consistent with several reconstructed demographic models, does not mean that a typical adult keeled over in their early 20s. It means that so many individuals died as infants and toddlers that the average across the whole population, newborns included, gets dragged down sharply. The more informative number is life expectancy at 15, calculated only from individuals who had already cleared the deadliest early years. Demographic reconstructions built from Neanderthal skeletal samples suggest that an individual who survived to 15 might reasonably expect to live into their late 20s or 30s, a meaningfully different picture from being told, flatly, that Neanderthals died at 20. The bones back this up directly. Once you exclude infants and small children from the sample entirely and look only at adult Neanderthal remains, the distribution of ages at death clusters heavily in the 20s and 30s, with the smaller cohort in their late 30s and 40s representing the genuine upper tier of Neanderthal longevity, not a wildly improbable outlier. Adulthood for a Neanderthal did not look like adulthood in any period of history most people are familiar with. The core economic reality of Neanderthal survival was that they hunted large, dangerous animals at extremely close range. Unlike the projectile technology that appears later among Upper Paleolithic humans, with lightweight darts thrown from atlatls at ranges of dozens of meters, the archaeological evidence for Neanderthal hunting weapons points overwhelmingly toward heavy thrusting spears, consone-tipped shafts designed to be driven into an animal's body from close range, sometimes within arm's length. A landmark study published by paleoanthropologists Thomas Berger and Eric Trinkhaus in 1995 compared the pattern of skeletal trauma found on Neanderthal remains against injury databases from a range of modern occupational groups, including construction workers, industrial laborers, and professional rodeo athletes. The closest statistical match, startlingly, was rodeo performers. Neanderthal skeletons show a strikingly high frequency of head and upper body trauma, with relatively fewer injuries to the legs, the exact pattern you would expect from an animal that has been wounded at close range and thrashes upward and outward in its final desperate moments. Hunting a red deer, an aurochs, or occasionally something as large as a woolly rhinoceros with a hand-thrust spear meant accepting, essentially every time you did it, a real chance of being gored, trampled, or struck hard enough to break bone. What makes this data more than a single grim statistic is what it implies about ordinary Neanderthal adulthood. If a significant fraction of adult skeletons show healed trauma consistent with dangerous close-range hunting, then surviving to middle age as a Neanderthal did not mean avoiding serious injury. It meant surviving serious injury, more than once, in a world with no antiseptic, no antibiotics, and no surgery beyond whatever a companion could do with their hands. a broken rib that punctured a lung, a skull fracture that caused internal bleeding, a deep gash that turned septic within days. Any of these represented an ordinary hazard of feeding a group of 10 or 15 people through an Ice Age winter. The fact that so many Neanderthal skeletons show fractures that healed, rather than fractures that appear to have been the immediate cause of death, tells you something important. These injuries were survivable, but only with help. Which raises the next hard question. Who was providing that help, and what did it actually take to keep a badly injured adult alive long enough to heal? The clearest answer to that question comes from a single individual, recovered from Shanidar cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, and catalogued by archaeologists as Shanidar I. Excavated in the early 1950s by Ralph Selecki and studied intensively for decades afterward, Shanidar I is one of the most extensively injured human skeletons ever recovered from the deep past, and also one of the oldest Neanderthals on record. Detailed skeletal analysis shows that this individual had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of the skull earlier in life, an injury that likely caused partial blindness. The right arm had been damaged so severely, probably from a wound or a birth defect compounded by later trauma, that it had withered, and the hand was essentially useless, with evidence suggesting the lower arm may have been amputated altogether. The right leg showed signs of a healed fracture that would have caused a pronounced limp. An analysis of the inner ear bones indicates significant hearing loss, likely near total deafness on at least one side. This was a man who could not see well out of one eye, could not hear well, could not use one arm, and walked with a limp, in an environment where hunting, mobility, and vigilance against predators were matters of daily survival. Age estimates place Shanidar I at somewhere between 35 and 50 years old at death, a genuinely old Neanderthal, and critically, he had been living with the worst of these impairments for years, possibly decades before he died. There is no version of this survival story that does not involve other people. A man who could not effectively hunt, could not easily flee danger, and likely could not process food or hides with full use of both hands, did not stay alive in an Ice Age landscape through sheer individual toughness. Someone was sharing meat with him that he had not helped kill. Someone was guiding him on the move, watching his blind side, warning him of hazards he could not hear approaching. This single skeleton, more than almost any other piece of Neanderthal evidence, forces a reconsideration of what Neanderthal social structure actually looked like. These were not loose, indifferent groups where the injured were abandoned to fend for themselves. They were small, tightly bonded communities where sustained, costly care for a severely disabled adult was not just possible, but apparently normal enough to leave repeated examples in the archaeological record. That pattern of care extends well beyond Shanidar I. At the same site, the skeleton catalogued as Shanidar III shows a wound to the ribs consistent with a stabbing injury, possibly from another Neanderthal's weapon, that appears to have partially healed before infection or complications eventually proved fatal weeks or months later. At La Pharisee in France, an adult skeleton shows extensive dental disease and tooth loss that would have made eating anything but the softest food impossible in the final years of life, again implying that someone was preparing food specifically suited to a companion who could no longer chew normally. Across dozens of sites, the recurring signature is the same: injury, followed by survival that required outside help, followed eventually by death from something else entirely, often much later. There is also growing evidence that Neanderthal care went slightly beyond proximity and food sharing alone. Researchers analyzing the hardened dental plaque, called calculus, preserved on the teeth of a Neanderthal skeleton from El Cedron in Spain, recovered traces of chamomile and yarrow, two plants with no significant nutritional value, but a long documented history of use as pain relief and anti-inflammatory treatments in later human medical traditions. The individual in question showed evidence of a dental abscess, a genuinely painful condition. The presence of these specific plants in his teeth, rather than in the general plant, remains scattered around the site, suggests deliberate selection, rather than accidental ingestion while foraging for food. It is not proof of a sophisticated Neanderthal pharmacy, but it does suggest that whatever inspired an injured or sick Neanderthal to reach for a bitter, non-nutritious plant was not pure chance. Somebody, at some point, had learned that certain leaves eased certain kinds of pain, and that knowledge had been passed along closely enough to still be in use when this particular individual needed it. Neanderthal medicine, if you can call it that, was not herbal remedies or surgical technique in any sophisticated sense. It was proximity, food sharing, a handful of plants known to ease pain, and time. It worked often enough to leave a substantial fossil record of people who, by any reasonable individual calculation, should not have lived as long as they did. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. None of this answers the most direct version of the original question, which is simply how old the oldest Neanderthals actually got. This turns out to be a harder question to answer precisely than it sounds, because aging a skeleton that is tens of thousands of years old relies on indirect methods, and those methods have real limits. The most reliable technique involves examining the wear patterns on molar teeth. Teeth wear down at a fairly predictable rate through a lifetime of chewing gritty, unprocessed food, and by comparing the degree of wear against known modern reference populations, researchers can estimate an age range, though the margin of error widens considerably past middle age. A second method examines the fusion of growth plates in the skeleton and the degree of degeneration in joints, particularly the vertebrae and hips, which accumulate wear-related damage, called osteoarthritis, in a roughly age-correlated pattern. Using these combined methods, Eric Trinkhaus and other researchers who have surveyed the full published catalog of Neanderthal remains, several hundred individuals recovered across Europe and Western Asia, have found that almost none show clear evidence of surviving past the age of 40. The Chapelle-aux-Saints individual and Shanidar 1, both estimated in the 35 to 45 range, sit near the upper edge of the entire known Neanderthal fossil record. A small handful of other individuals, including remains from Crépina and from Saint-Césaire in France, have been tentatively aged into a similar range, but genuinely old age, what a modern person would think of as a person in their 60s, 70s, or beyond, appears to be effectively absent from the entire Neanderthal skeletal record currently known to science. One especially direct piece of comparative evidence comes from a 2004 study by paleoanthropologists Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The two researchers built what they called an old-to-young adult ratio, comparing the number of individuals in a fossil sample who died as older adults against the number who died as younger adults, across a sweep of hominin populations spanning several million years. Their sample of Neanderthal remains produced one of the lowest ratios in the entire dataset. For every Neanderthal who reached what the study defined as older adulthood, roughly twice as many died younger. When Kaspari and Lee ran the same calculation on early Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens populations living in similar European environments not long after, the ratio flipped dramatically. Older adults in those human populations outnumbered younger adult deaths by a ratio approaching 5-to-1. Something had changed, and it had changed quickly in evolutionary terms. The study's authors argued that this shift towards substantially greater adult longevity may have been one of the most consequential developments in the whole story of human evolution, because more surviving grandparents meant more accumulated knowledge circulating through a group, more available caregivers freeing up younger adults to hunt and forage, and more generations overlapping at once to pass skills along directly rather than through fragmentary secondhand memory. Whether the Neanderthal side of that comparison reflects biology, environment, social structure, or simply the limits of a small fossil sample is still debated. What is not in dispute is that something in the transition to modern humans in Europe pushed survival into old age from a rare event into something closer to routine. This is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the absence of very old skeletons does not necessarily mean Neanderthals were biologically incapable of living longer. It could mean exactly that. Or it could mean something quite different, that the sample of Neanderthal remains recovered so far, several hundred individuals representing a species that existed across a continent for over 300,000 years, is simply too small and too biased to capture rare long-lived outliers. Cave burial, which preserves bone far better than exposure on open ground, may have been reserved disproportionately for individuals who died at certain ages or in certain circumstances, skewing what survives to be found. A 2017 analysis published by researchers including Trinkhaus directly compared Neanderthal age-at-death profiles against equivalent profiles from early Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens populations living in similar environments, and found that the two species show broadly similar mortality curves overall, both weighted heavily toward younger adults, both showing relatively few individuals surviving past 40. If that comparison holds, then the harsh truth may not be that Neanderthals specifically were fragile or short-lived as a species. It may be that nobody living through repeated glacial winters, close-range megafauna hunting, and childbirth without medical intervention, regardless of which human species they belonged to, reliably made it to 60. The physical toll visible in these skeletons also complicates any simple comparison to modern aging. A Neanderthal individual estimated at 35 to 40 years old at death frequently shows degenerative joint disease, particularly in the spine, hips, and knees, at a level that a modern orthopedic specialist would associate with someone decades older. Some of this reflects the sheer mechanical demands of Neanderthal life, decades of carrying heavy loads over rough terrain, of close-range combat with large animals, of repeatedly enduring cold that forces the body to work harder to maintain core temperature. Neanderthal skeletons in general are markedly more robust than those of contemporary Homo sapiens. Thicker bone walls, larger muscle attachment points, evidence of a body built for raw physical output rather than efficiency. That robustness came with a cost. A skeleton built to absorb repeated physical trauma still accumulates that trauma over a lifetime, and by the time a Neanderthal reached what would have been early middle age by modern standards, the cumulative wear on major joints could already be severe enough to limit mobility. In this sense, calling a 40-year-old Neanderthal old is not simply a statement about rarity. It is a statement about the physical condition their body was actually in by that point, closer in practical function to a modern person well into their 7th or 8th decade than to a modern 40-year-old. There is a specific segment of the population where this picture shifts in an interesting direction, and that is women. Reconstructing female mortality patterns from Neanderthal skeletal remains is more difficult than reconstructing male patterns, because fewer clearly identifiable adult female skeletons have been recovered and studied in detail. But the evidence that does exist points toward childbirth as one of the single deadliest events in a Neanderthal woman's life. Neanderthal pelvic anatomy, reconstructed in detail from a small number of well-preserved specimens, suggests a birth canal shaped somewhat differently from that of modern humans, and Neanderthal infants appear to have had proportionally large heads relative to that of Homo sapiens newborns. Combine a difficult anatomical fit with the complete absence of any form of medical intervention for a complicated birth, and childbirth becomes a recurring lethal event rather than a routine one. Some researchers have proposed that this dynamic, dangerous childbirth combined with dangerous close-range hunting for men may have produced a Neanderthal population where neither sex had much of a demographic advantage in survival, unlike many later human populations where adult male mortality from hunting and warfare consistently outpaced female mortality once childbearing years had passed. The hardest individual case in the entire Neanderthal fossil record, the one that pushes every question about age, injury, and survival to its absolute limit, is a skeleton recovered from the site of Le Regourdou in southwestern France. The remains show extensive, long-healed trauma across the shoulder and arm, likely from a serious fall or crushing injury sustained many years before death, alongside signs of chronic joint disease that would have made basic tasks like gathering firewood or processing a hide painfully difficult in the final years of life. Isotopic analysis of the bones indicates a diet extremely heavy in meat, consistent with an individual who was likely dependent on others to hunt and process food on their behalf for an extended period, since injuries to the shoulder and arm this severe would have made independent hunting essentially impossible. Age estimates place this individual, once again, in the same narrow upper band that keeps appearing throughout the Neanderthal record, somewhere in their late 30s to mid-40s. An individual who by any calculation should have died from their injuries within weeks, and who instead appears to have lived for years afterward, sustained entirely by a social group willing to shoulder the cost. The site itself sits in rugged, isolated terrain, far from the kind of easy, reliable food sources that might have made supporting an incapacitated adult a low-effort decision. Every meal shared with this individual came at a direct cost to everyone else in the group, calories that could otherwise have gone to a nursing mother, a growing child, or a hunter who might need the extra reserve on the next dangerous chase. That the group kept paying that cost, apparently for years, says as much about Neanderthal social bonds as any single injury says about Neanderthal bodies. These demographic patterns carried consequences that reached far beyond any single individual's lifespan. Population geneticists modeling Neanderthal genetic diversity from ancient DNA extracted at sites including Vindija Cave in Croatia have consistently found signs of a small, fragmented overall population, likely never numbering more than a few tens of thousands of individuals across the entire species range at any given time. A species where relatively few adults survived long enough to become genuine elders was also a species where the pool of accumulated, transmissible knowledge stayed thinner across each generation than it might otherwise have been. Fewer surviving grandparents meant fewer people available to mind children while parents hunted, fewer independent repositories of decades of accumulated environmental knowledge, and less redundancy if a single skilled adult died suddenly. None of this means longevity alone determined the eventual fate of the species. Climate change, competition for resources, and interbreeding with incoming Homo sapiens populations all appear to have played substantial roles in the disappearance of Neanderthals as a distinct population by around 40,000 years ago. But the demographic engine underlying daily survival, an engine that ran on close-range hunting risk, dangerous childbirth, and a hard ceiling on adult longevity, was the same engine every Neanderthal generation had to run on, for the entire 300,000-year existence of the species, without ever finding a way to meaningfully extend it. Taken together, these cases point toward a conclusion that runs against the popular image of Neanderthals as solitary brutes eking out a short, isolated existence. The real picture is closer to the opposite. A Neanderthal life was short by modern standards almost entirely because of external environmental risk, infant mortality, childbirth complications, and close-range hunting trauma, not because their bodies were biologically incapable of aging further. And the individuals who did manage to survive those risks into their 30s and 40s did so specifically because they were embedded in social groups that shared food with the injured, protected the disabled, and kept the old and impaired alive, well past the point where an isolated individual would have died. In a modern context, we sometimes talk about the value a society places on its elderly and vulnerable members as if it were a purely moral or philosophical question. In a Neanderthal band of 10 to 20 people, it was a direct, measurable survival strategy. An older individual, even one who could no longer hunt, still carried decades of accumulated knowledge, which plants were toxic, which river crossings flooded first, which caves held predators, which seasons brought the herds. Keeping that person alive, fed, and present around the fire was not simply an act of compassion. It was an investment in the survival of everyone else. What this means for the original question, how long could a Neanderthal actually live, is that the honest answer has two layers. The raw ceiling visible in the current fossil record sits somewhere around 40 to 45 years, a boundary that shows up again and again across sites separated by thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years, from La Chapelle-aux-Saints to Shanidar to La Regourdou. But reaching even that ceiling required surviving a gauntlet that killed a large share of every generation before their second birthday, that killed young adults through hunting trauma at rates comparable to modern rodeo athletes, and that killed women disproportionately through childbirth. The Neanderthals who did make it into their fourth decade of life were not simply the lucky ones. They were, in a very real sense, the socially supported ones. Individuals whose communities had judged them worth keeping alive through blindness, deafness, missing limbs, and toothless old age. long after any purely selfish calculation would have written them off. The man from La Chapelle-aux-Saints could not chew solid food for years before he died. Someone made sure he never had to. Shanidar I could not see out of one eye, could not hear well, and had lost the use of an entire arm, and still someone walked beside him on his blind side for what may have been 20 years or more. These were not isolated acts of kindness from unusually generous individuals. They were recurring, repeated patterns found at sites separated by thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years, which means they were not exceptions to how Neanderthals lived. They were closer to a rule. A species that hunted animals many times its own size at arm's length, that lost close to a third of its children before their first birthday, and that watched its women face childbirth without any medical safety net at all, could not have survived for over 300,000 years on individual toughness alone. It survived because injury and old age did not automatically mean abandonment. Whatever else separated Neanderthals from the modern humans who eventually replaced them across Europe, the impulse to keep a broken, blind, half-deaf companion alive at the fire for another winter was not one of those differences. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.